Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Marines Memorial Association, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Our Salute to Iraq and Afghanistan War Veterans. It's an absolute honor and privilege to be standing here in front of you this morning or this evening. I'm deeply humbled and honored. And as I look out here at so many distinguished guests, it's next to impossible to name everyone. What I would like to do as a very first thing is to recognize a distinguished Marine who served in 4 different federal cabinet positions, and as Secretary of State played a key role in implementing a foreign policy that ended the Cold War. And in 1989 was awarded the Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian award. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honorable George Shultz. Sir, you honor us with your presence this evening. Thank you very, very much. Our speaker tonight is General Jim Mattis, United States Marine Corps retired, the former commander of U.S. Central Command and currently Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution. In a little while, the General will speak with you, and then he'll take some questions by you, and then we'll gather up on the 10th floor for reception and dessert. My name is Frank Pulley. I'm a retired Marine Sergeant Major. Thank you. Who is blessed and honored to serve in our beloved Corps for over 30 years. And at this time, I respectfully request for all those who've ever served in our armed forces to please stand. Ladies and gentlemen, please look around and join me in a round of applause for those who have worn the cloth of our nation and sworn to support and defend our Constitution. Thank you very much. It is now my distinct honor and privilege to talk about this evening's distinguished guest. I say talk about because General Jim Mattis is someone who needs no formal introduction. He's one of our nation's most combat experienced and revered general officers. As I shared, he needs no formal introduction, but I know General Mattis well enough to know that the last thing he wants me to do is to stand here and recite his bio line by line. You have his bio in your program, and I would ask you to take an opportunity to read it at your leisure. Before the General comes out, I would like to share some things about General Mattis that's not captured in his bio. I had the pleasure to serve with General Mattis when he was the Commanding General of 1 Marine Expeditionary Force, and I was the Sergeant Major of 1st Marine Division, serving alongside our now Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, General John Paxton. And before the General arrived back to the West Coast, there was a lot of talk about him. There was talk about his quotes. No better friend, no worst enemy. Fight with a happy heart. Complacency kills. And that's about all I can share with you this evening. There was talk about some of the changes he was going to make in the MIF. Tentative personnel moves and reassignments to include sergeants major. As you can imagine, there was apprehension, tension, stress, angst, and in some cases, chaos. You name it, it was there. But you know, as a division sergeant major, I soon learned that the CG of the MIF, all he wanted was for his leaders in the Marines to take care of the Corps, take care of our country, and to take care of each other. And that he had zero tolerance for those who did not. For those that shared his views and his values and vision, there were no issues. For those that did, I can't say the same. Henry David Thoreau once wrote, "No one cares how much you know till they know how much you care." And retired Marine and Medal of Honor recipient Colonel Wesley Fox wrote in his book, The 6 Essential Elements of Leadership, that it's care, personality, knowledge, motivation, and communication that makes an effective leader. General Mattis epitomizes all those traits. And much has been written and said about General Mattis's personality, his knowledge, his motivation, and his communication. But what I soon learned and admired most about him to this day was how he led from the front, how he was deeply humble, and how much he truly, truly cares. I saw it in garrison at 1 MIF at Camp Pendleton, and I witnessed it firsthand during a visit to Iraq in December 2006. Yes, the mission remains first, but like most effective leaders, he cared about his Marines, especially the enlisted ranks. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Jim Mattis, United States Marine Corps retired.
Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Sergeant Major Pulley, a fellow Blue Diamond, 1st Marine Division Marine. I just tell you, he's a leader who knows how to put steel on target. He's one of those strong NCOs who reminds us that the Marine Corps has no confusion about what it exists for, and that is to fight and to fight well. Secretary Schultz, the senior Marine at Stanford University, who I now report to, for you young men here, young Marines here, just a reminder that some people, their name alone is the passport to the American people's trust. And as you look at your own role, just remember, so long as what you're doing builds the trust, when in doubt, just ask, what would George Schultz do in this position? You'll never go very far off, I guarantee you. My thanks, General Myatt, for what you did, for what you showed us. You now guide this jewel, the Marine Memorial Club. But back in 1990, 1991, you took the theory of maneuver warfare and you gave me a mental model of how you take thousands of Marines into a fight and strike hard and deep. And 10 years later, after some maniacs thought they could attack America and kill thousands of innocent people from 70-odd countries, I used the example of 1st Marine Division and Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and our enemies paid a price. I would also note that General Johnson's here, and if anyone showed a degree of patience with a young officer when I wrote him a 5-page screed about why I needed certain decorations for my men who were in an assault battalion in Desert Storm, and he called and gave me a 1-sentence response 5 days later, said, "I will take care of this," and he did, and earned my undying gratitude forever. Also, my fond respects to the officers of my battalion, the battalion Ken Jordan that you commanded in the 1st Marine Brigade, who are here tonight. As we used to say in those days, if you ain't 3-3, and we'll go on to it from there. But I can't come to the Marine Memorial Club, to this setting in this all-American city, beautiful San Francisco, a great American city, especially when I'm among fellow veterans, so many of you here. I can't come here without a sense of gratitude, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would just tell you it's to the NCOs who are in the audience tonight, whether you served in Korea or Vietnam or in the wars since. The NCOs who always kept their fighting faith, they always aggressively carried out my direction, and really they're the ones who really taught me how to lead. The second group that I owe gratitude here and I want to pay public homage to are the Vietnam-era officers, the ones who came out of that war, stayed with the Corps, and taught me how to wield the most fearsome combined arms fighting team in the world. And of course, last but never least, I must express my gratitude to a group that we're connected to forever, one to which all Marines bear witness, and that in those junior Marines and sailors that I served alongside, and later in my career to the soldiers, the airmen, the Coast Guardsmen, and the foreign troops who always moved against our enemies. Generals get a lot of credit. Very little of it is earned by their own blood, sweat, and tears. It's earned by the young men who shoulder the rucks and who go forward always against our enemies. And of course to their families. The families that too often paid the price in our lads killed and grievously wounded, and for whom I have the greatest fondness and respect. And I would just say that for all of our difference, for the veterans here tonight, in whatever ranks we were when we served, there was no difference in our commitment. We were co-equal in our commitment to the mission, and it meant that we were all equal in each other's eyes as we crossed the line of departure. To prime the pump for the best part of any night like this, which is always the question and answer period, I thought I'd talk about two major themes. One of them is the need for continued American engagement in the world. And I'll use my former region, the Mideast, to showcase our interests for why we must stay engaged, and especially you veterans. I don't care if you're veterans of World War II, of Korea, Vietnam, of hundreds of little fights that we've had in between. more than anyone, we need to explain to you what is our foreign policy, and we need you to also speak up about why we need to stay engaged in the world as you study the issues and read the news that comes across each day. You've earned, by your service, perhaps a special place in looking at these issues and talking when you know what the ultimate price is if we have to put our troops' lives on the line. The second, I want to discuss our role of our military in this era that we find America facing right now, and in light of our national situation, and also recognizing that some of the veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan truly have questions about our service there. So first, on American engagement, as George Shultz says, we have a world awash in change. Awash in change. Everything, we see it shifting around us, from technology to the way diversity plays a role. Certainly, the information age has its own impact. And I would just tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that perceptions of U.S. retrenchment bring an urgent peril to us, because American retreat is not a change that is welcomed by thoughtful elements around the world. Fears of our withdrawal resonate and deeply trouble our indispensable allies in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia. They are deeply troubled by what they perceive to be our pulling back. In nations that have stood with us, the fear of American disengagement is real and bolsters our adversaries' hopes. For in a globally connected world, we withdraw at the risk of rediscovering history's lessons, learned at a bloody cost, lessons that should not be forgotten, as our internal discontent in this country understandably grabs our attention. In 1914 and for several years thereafter, we watched from the sidelines as France and Britain were bled dry by German militarism before standing up for our values. From 1939 until the end of 1941, when the attack on Pearl Harbor forced us into the war, we watched from the sidelines again as fascists stormed Europe and Asia, pulverizing our friends. In 1950, an oversight left South Korea vulnerable and cost us dearly, just as our late entry into World War I and World War II had cost us. And those are only a few well-known examples of the cost to us here in America when isolationism takes hold of our foreign policy. So we should take pause when some on the far left or the far right of our body politic urge American withdrawal from the world stage. For each time in our recent history that we followed such a path, our country was forced to use our military to reverse a worse situation because of what we allowed to fester rather than to confront. And we recognize today that our people and our allies paid a terrible price for that wrong-headed approach. I want to point out that engagement does not indicate or require an expanded or even frequent use of our military instrument. America, after all, has both the power of inspiration and of intimidation. Some Americans have believed that we overutilized our power of intimidation in the last decade, that we basically militarized our foreign policy while failing to fully employ the traditional tools of statecraft. But it would be a false choice to say the sole options today are between isolationism on the one hand or more wars on the other. And I would just turn to the tumultuous Middle East because it provides a glimpse of the challenges we must deal with and from which we cannot hide. The potential for North American energy independence during the current decade could cause anyone in America to want to recoil from that maddeningly complex region. But let's pause and let's impose reason over impulse, highlighting three anchors: our economic, diplomatic, and security interests are interrelated anchors that I believe demand our continued American involvement. First, there's the economic imperative, and in a word, that specifically is oil. A globally traded commodity, and 40% of the world's oil comes out of the Arabian Gulf. We Americans may not directly consume Mideast oil in our future, but in a globalized world, our economy, our American economy, is inextricably connected to countries that rely totally on Mideast oil. And should that supply be jeopardized, then from Massachusetts to Texas to here in California, the world's largest economy, ours, will be immediately and severely impacted. And let's remember that the price at the pump will be largely set worldwide by the price of Mideast oil, such as the weight of its impact. As Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates has stated so clearly, because Middle East oil is so critical to the world's economy, security in the Gulf is an international responsibility. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet has demonstrated America's role in that security imperative, orchestrating international mine-clearing exercises by dozens of countries representing all continents except Antarctica. And when we got them all together, I was down there in Antarctica looking for a penguin to make certain that they would also be on board. But the international mine-clearing exercises, in effect, silenced Tehran's bombastic rhetoric heard 2 years ago about mining the Gulf waters. Now, ladies and gentlemen, only the U.S. Navy has the trust and the military capability to draw nations such as Canada, Estonia, Djibouti, Singapore, Japan, and dozens more into a coherent military show of strength and international resolve, toning down Iran's rhetoric before it led to stupidity in the Gulf, buying time for diplomatic moves to address the Iranian issue while keeping alive the world's fragile economic recovery. So there's an economic imperative that we stay engaged there for our own good. The second anchor that should keep us engaged, besides the economic, is diplomatic. And I'll put it in very blunt terms. If we want friends when we have crises, we'd better stand by them when they face crises. In Afghanistan today, 50 nations stand together, united in the largest wartime coalition in modern world history. They are there because we are there. This includes some very non-traditional security partners. Let me go back to United Arab Emirates. We call them Little Sparta in the U.S. military. It's an example because they've stood by us in Desert Shield and Desert Storm, in Somalia, in the Balkans, both Kosovo and Bosnia, in Libya, where with one phone call we called and said, we need to have you support us, NATO, against Gaddafi. And one phone call is all it took, and F-16s, the most modern in the world, they have purchased the most recently built ones, and they were launching for bases in Europe from which they would engage against Gaddafi's troops. In Afghanistan, when political reasons drove the French and British to draw down their troops, the United Arab Emirates added more troops to prevent me from having to go back to the Commandant of the Marine Corps and the Chief of Staff of the Army and ask them to make up the difference that we were losing. Jordan, another country that stood by us, reassuring us just a year ago that they will stand with us in Afghanistan, quote, until the last American soldier comes home. Ladies and gentlemen, we need allies such as this, and if we want that level of support, when we're in need, we must stand with them in their time of need. United Arab Emirates stand on the front lines against Iran, literally across the Gulf from them, unapologetic in their opposition to the Iranian efforts with terrorism and with a nuclear weapons program. Jordan is dealing with over 1 million refugees from Syria next door, a breeding ground for terrorism. So there are these economic and diplomatic anchors to why we need to stay engaged, but there's also a purely security anchor. Specifically, our friends and partners are standing with us against Iranian and al-Qaeda terrorism and belligerence. And on 9/11, we all saw what happens when we can't achieve advance warning, when we can't gain an effective collaborative counterterror effort around the world. No country alone can defeat or even derail terrorist attacks. We need swift intel sharing with engaged partners around the world and offensive operations to catch the enemy as early as possible in an age when a handful of nutcases can kill on an industrial level. Al-Qaeda's senior leadership has been hit hard in Pakistan's Fatah, the the area, the frontier area in the high country. And there are not many left, frankly, to collect their 401k programs. Yet in Syria, al-Qaeda is growing from 5 to maybe 10,000 now of fighters. In Somalia, where the African Union has roughly handled them, there are still al-Shabaab's troops who are down but not out. In North Africa, they've been kicked around by a superb French effort there, but they are still lethal in North Africa in the poorly governed spaces. And in Yemen, you see the most active al-Qaeda effort targeted on the United States. The second branch of Islamic jihadist terrorists, these being the al-Qaeda, the first being the al-Qaeda, is the Lebanese Hezbollah, the one supported by Iran. And those Iranian-inspired, supported terrorists, you know them as Lebanese Hezbollah and associated movements, have basically been untouched by our counterterrorism efforts. They have murdered Israeli tourists in Bulgaria, earning the anger of the European Union. They plotted to murder the Saudi Arabian ambassador in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And absent one fundamental mistake, they would have killed probably hundreds of Americans in their effort when they killed him. Together, these two terrorist threat streams, al-Qaeda on the one hand, the Iranian on the other, are not going away. And if I was to give you a mental model for what this war will look like, it will not be a signing on the decks of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. It'll be more like the U.S. cavalry against the American Indians, with decades of skirmishing across the American West. That is what we face in the future. So for these interests, economic, diplomatic, and security, we must remain engaged with the troubled Middle East, working by, with, and through our allies and partners. And I recall, as I look back over my years of fighting in that region, that I fought many times, but I never fought in an all-American formation. We always had allies, Arab allies, on our left, our right, and in fact, when General Myatt ordered me into the minefields in Desert Storm, I had 75 Kuwaitis inside my Marine Infantry Battalion that was to open the way through the minefields. We have partners who are more than willing to carry their share. We have partners who have stood with us through thick and thin. We have partners who seriously don't want to be surprised or disappointed when we Americans fail to recognize geopolitical realities. Our foreign policy framework for the Middle East, it's very simple, has four framing principles. One is we support each nation's political reform at its own pace. We support each nation's economic reforms so more young people feel they have something to gain from their future. We support a re-energized Middle East peace process, and you see Secretary Kerry moving heaven and earth on this. We should not turn over this unsustainable situation to our children. We should deal with it. And then, of course, we support our friends and their territorial integrity against the Iranian bullying, against the terrorist threat that they face in a much more local way than we do here at home. So those are the four framing principles. But right now, ladies and gentlemen, there's a prevalent concern about Americans retreating around the world. This was one of the major issues I dealt with during my last tour, and only our adversaries can take heart from an American retreat. I saw it recently suggested in print that perhaps the 1st Marine Division's motto of no better friend, no worse enemy would be a sound guide for our approach to the challenges we face, reassuring our friends and tempering our adversaries' designs. With history as our guide, we don't need to hatch shameful outcomes driven largely by historical or geopolitical ignorance. Let us remember, too, that we can sometimes see America most clearly through foreign eyes, and recall a French traveler's sentiments from some 150 years ago to the effect that America will be a great country so long as it is a good country. And if America ever ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. Now, you and I inherited a great country, in no small part thanks to the veterans who sit in this audience. And I would just tell you that we do not have, I believe, the right to surrender that legacy simply because we're disgruntled here at home. At this point in time, the greatest provocation to our enemies would be America's failure to wisely stand up to them alongside our friends when our vital interests are at stake. And certainly you veterans here in the audience tonight should let your voices be heard that what you fought for was an America that turned over the same legacy to the next generation that we received from those who went before us. Let me shift gears here for a few minutes and speak about our military in this situation, in this era that we live in. As a nation, we all know we are on a fiscally unsustainable path. It cannot be continued. We are spending more money than we take in. Our growing national debt is a political and moral disgrace. Our approach to dealing with it is irresponsible. Left unchecked, our national debt will enslave future generations and endanger our freedom. To highlight the danger, ladies and gentlemen, by the end of this decade, I believe we will spend more servicing our debt, paying interest on our debt, than we spend on national defense. To me, this means that our national debt becomes our primary national security threat because our economy has always been the engine for our national defense. A declining fiscal situation will tell on us just as it is told on other nations throughout history. And history is quite clear that any nation that cannot keep its economic house in order cannot sustain a credible military. And America's moral example, its diplomatic efforts, unsupported by a credible military, is strategically impotent. Our military, like those throughout the Western democracies, is getting smaller. It is inevitable that with a smaller military, we will do less with our military. What is critical is that we not do it less well. When the elected commander-in-chief next sends us into a brawl, it must be the enemy's longest day and the enemy's worst day. If the values that we want to pass on, the values that grew out of the Enlightenment, that are given words, are given voice in our Declaration, in our Constitution, in our Federalist Papers, if those words are to be passed on, those freedoms are to be passed on intact to the next generation. Yet Western political leadership, with no notion of how to reverse the economic decline or how to responsibly reduce our entitlement culture, means our military may need to buy time for our country, and to do so without the numerical or technological overmatch that we enjoyed since World War II. Our allies today, as I noted earlier, are very worried about American indifference, and we all know that our adversaries are watching and calculating. We must assume that we will be tested in the years ahead, which means our military must assume that it must be prepared to buy time while America can regain a degree of political unity, a unity of purpose that permits a government founded on competing powers, that permits that government to compromise and to actually govern. To compromise, of course, being a fundamental necessity at the heart of a democratic government when our founding fathers set up the American model that's being questioned today, politically, economically, and cultured. Because until our country can get back on a sound path of governance, the military and its veterans, and I want to emphasize its veterans here, the military and its veterans will need to sustain their fighting faith. Together, we must be at our best when times are at their worst. Remember that the U.S. military has been through far worse, and there's no room for woe is me, for self-pity, or for cynicism. Further, there is no room for military people, including our veterans, to see themselves as victims, even if so many of our countrymen are prone to relish that role. In the military, we make choices. We're not victims. And we've bought time before in our history. Look back on Valley Forge. We're freezing and ill-clad, the summer soldiers deserting, yet the spring saw our toughened troops, and here I would emphasize allied with our French allies, march out to defeat the Redcoats, who only a short time later would humble Napoleon. Our military also bought time in World War II, at the start of the war where Secretary Schultz fought as a Marine in the Pacific, because then grimly determined troops fought on even when they knew they could not be relieved at Bataan, and they threw off the enemy's offensive timeline, buying the needed time for our nation to gather strength and go on our own counter-offensive. And here I speak directly to the combat veterans of our current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. All volunteers, you look past the hot political rhetoric swirling around these little understood wars, and you rallied to the flag. You signed blank checks payable with your lives to the American people. And for the first major war in our history, our nation fought without a draft. Unlike the Civil War, unlike World War I, unlike World War II, unlike Korea, unlike Vietnam, a draft that pushed me into the military, you, the volunteers of this war, are the element of this generation that is demonstrably great, shown not by your words, but by your actions. You vets and the Gold Star parents here tonight, Diane, those who might wonder about the purpose of your family's sacrifice during this long war, all of us must remember there is a great deal of difference between the national level of commitment and our personal level of commitment. That difference is highlighted first by you veterans and your valor and your ferocity that sent a critically necessary message to our enemies. To those enemies I noted earlier who thought that by hurting us on 9/11 that they could scare us. You vets who stepped forward without self-pity and steadfastly went after this enemy, you showed them that the descendants of Shiloh, of Belleau Wood, of Iwo, of Chosin Reservoir and Khe Sanh, you showed them that free men and free women can fight like the Dickens and we don't scare. Second, in our personal commitment, we fought to bring each other home. And our comrade spirits, be they living or dead, their spirits live on in each of us and bring a noble purpose to our lives, those of us who are lucky enough to get this bonus of another day. And to our final days, that purpose is never to be forgotten. Physically or spiritually, we did bring each other home, and we want no pity. At a time when many Americans asked what's in it for them, we who fought asked for only one entitlement. We asked only to be entitled to the honor of fighting for our country so we could pass on to the next generation these same liberties that we enjoy. You veterans of OEF and OIF have sent an undeniable message, a critical message. And it shows up in Churchill, who once put it in words, basically that once Americans have exhausted all the possible alternatives, we will do the right thing. You veterans, you did the right thing, and it didn't take you the draft to drive you into the ranks. In this situation as well, again, we can see the role you played, perhaps through different eyes, and that may help us to see what we who serve can easily miss. Jackie Robinson, who was a sparkling ball player and a hero to so many of us back in the day, wrote his own epitaph. On his gravestone in Cypress Hills Cemetery in New York City, his words read, "A life is not important except in the impact it has on other lives." For you veterans of this war, whose ethical and total commitment represent all that is great about our country is stronger thanks to your commitment and your blood, sweat, and tears. For you veterans who shared what Civil War infantry officer and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. called the incommunicable experience of war, you must know that your example is the meaning of your service and of the time you've spent fighting overseas, that your impact on the lives of others will continue to resonate because your comrades and your shipmates will not let it die in our hearts. And for myself, ladies and gentlemen, I can only say that I will be forever humbled for the time when I was permitted to march alongside these veterans, the finest of men, the finest of patriots, young men and women, on whom this experiment that you and I call America ultimately depends. So thank you very much to all of you veterans. It's a pleasure, it's an honor, it's humbling to stand up here in front of you, knowing I do so thanks to what veterans over many, many years, 4 decades actually, did so that I could be representing them here tonight. Thank you, and Semper Fi. Thank you. And now, Sergeant Major, we get to the good part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks. Please be seated. Hey, thanks so much, General Mattis. So as you can imagine, there's lots of questions, and I know you have answers for each and every one of them. As a matter of fact, we have about 50 questions for you, but I've narrowed them down, I think, to 8 or 9 for you, sir, for this evening. The first one, sir, is, in your opinion, what's the most important trait a leader should possess to effectively lead their people?
Yeah, I've thought about this one for a long time, Sergeant Major, and you know, I can walk into a combat outpost in the high country in Afghanistan, or I can get off a helicopter on a ship deck, and in 15 minutes, I can tell you if it's a happy ship or a happy unit or an unhappy one. And I would say that you have to have officers, NCOs who know their stuff, but more than that, you need ones who can not only build trust and respect in the unit, but I would use another word, affection. An affection that is so strong that literally the unit can take casualties and keep functioning. An affection that's so strong that you say, I will not let my buddy down. And I think that as you look at this, it comes down to building trust. That is the metric, that's the coin of the realm. And what you've got to be able to do is connect with your passion for excellence, but you're at the same time balanced with your compassion for their dreams, their goals, their hopes to live another day. And if they believe you care about them, then you can speak very bluntly, very directly to them, and they're ready to go back into the brawl. But I would add the word that you've got to be able to win the compassion, the affection of your troops, using your compassion for those young men and women who step forward and wear the nation's cloth.
Thanks, General. Sure, the next question is your views on the Israeli-Palestine peace process.
Yeah, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we've all in this room lived with this problem our entire lives. There is no additional data. There is no blinding flash that's going to come. The challenge that we face there is significant and it is difficult. But when you look at our Secretary of State and you see his constant efforts to try to bring these two sides together, knowing that we cannot sustain, no one can sustain this level of hatred and friction going on. It is unsustainable. I only hope that the protagonists on the Palestinian and Israeli sides want to find a solution as bad as the American Secretary of State. It's a very difficult issue, but right now is probably our last best chance. And the reason is that the Israeli settlements, where they're being built, could make the two-state solution impossible within a matter of a very short period of time. So we need to work on this. We need to be very adamant that this must be solved. But at the same time, one thing I've learned in this part of the world, it's very hard to care more about their children's futures than they care. We have got to try to summon their better angels and bring it together and see if they can sit down for their children's sake and get over this thing. But I don't have a strong solution. I don't have the blinding flash for the obvious. They just have to decide it's gone on long enough. And we've seen things like this ended. We saw it ended in South Africa, and the skeptics, the cynics said Mandela could never pull it off. A lot more than just Mandela, but Mandela was one of the leaders. We watched in Northern Ireland where people said it can't be stopped, this Catholic-Protestant fight. Well, it's been stopped in both those places. We have a better world. So I don't buy into cynicism on it. We must keep working on it. Even if we're not successful, if we keep working it, we lower the heat in the Middle East and we remove the drive by some of the people who want war, who want the fighting to go on. We reduce their chance to raise money, to get volunteers. So we've got to continue to work it. I admire and salute Secretary Kerry's efforts, but at the same time, the protagonists have got to want it just as much. We can't care more than they care about their children.
Thanks, General. Sir, here's a two-part question. One of them is from a colonel here in the audience, and the other is from a non-commissioned officer or a corporal. And the question is, Do you feel the U.S. should still have U.S. military in Iraq? The second part of that, sir, is that your thoughts of al-Qaeda's flag once again flying over places like Fallujah after our losses in April of 2004 and our gains in November 2004.
Yeah, well, and now I'm going to speak right from the heart, Diane, and you know why. We paid a very terrible price in our soldiers, our sailors, our Marines who died to take Fallujah. But we gave to the Iraqi people the opportunity. Now, I realize it's a young country and it's an imperfect country, and our enemies out in that part of the world are pretty merciless. But at the same time, should we have stayed there? Should we have kept troops there? The military advice was, I think you're aware, was that we keep troops there. We wouldn't have come out of Germany in 1946, 47, and brought all of our troops home after what we paid in World War II. To the U.S. military, we did recommend we keep troops there. The decision was made that we would not, and the enemy has taken advantage. Vacuums in that part of the world are often not filled by good impulses, good people. But at the same time, I would not yet say that the Iraqi people have lost this. It's not good. It's a challenge. But sometimes, you know, years into our Revolutionary War, you could have been forgiven by saying George Washington is just not seeing reality. We can't beat these guys. We've been at war for years now, and he ought to just give up. Well, he didn't give up. And we'll watch and see how the Iraqis do it. They have a very young military. It is not a good military yet. It's still being put together. And we'll have to watch and see if they take advantage of it. What we did with our veterans, we gave them the chance. And that's what we owed them, and that's a message we sent to the enemy who learned it would be their longest day, it would be their worst day if they took us on. And we sent a message there that will never be forgotten. It will stand the test of time. Now, whether the Iraqis take advantage of that opportunity, that's up to them. But bottom line is, the recommendation was we keep the troops there. We didn't, and the Iraqis are somewhat on their own now, and they're going to have to deal with this in their own way.
Thanks, General. Sir, the next question surrounds the drawdown. And what do you think of the proposed drawdown of U.S. forces to pre-World War II levels?
Yeah, you know, ladies and gentlemen, when you look at the national debt and you look at what we've done over the years, then we're going to have to get a handle on that. And so long as our country cannot get a handle on its entitlements, one of the few areas the President, the Congress can turn to find money that right now they've got to find, they've got to reduce this expenditure, is the military. What it means is we will do less with the military. It means eventually we are going to have to change our expectations, and we're going to have to change our strategy. Specifically, it means we're going to have to reduce the political ends that we're willing to fight for. And that's a reality. We have no moral obligation to do the impossible. I want to say that again. We have no moral obligation to do the impossible. So if it means we cannot stop genocide in country X, or if it means that we cannot stand by a certain ally, then that's the reality. But as it stands right now, we are right on the cusp of where we need to say we need to change the strategy, that the numbers of troops no longer permits us to have the same strategy that we have had pretty much unquestioningly for a long time. That's a reality, because all strategy is aligning political ends with the means: diplomatic, economic, CIA covert, information, Radio Free Europe, military. And when your means no longer match what is being demanded by the political ends, you must reduce the political ends. So we will have to reduce the political ends. That's a reality. What's important is that when the President sends us in, as I mentioned earlier, that when we actually go, we go with everything we need, we go with overmatch, and we go in and we dominate at the point of contact. And at that point, it will come down once again, for those of you who have employed your bodies, your troops, for the last 600 meters of our foreign policy, It's got to be that you send a shockwave back through our enemy, said we don't ever want to take these guys on. And that shockwave will buy us some more time, and eventually the Americans will get their act back together. It's that simple. But right now, we're going to have to reduce our political ends with an army the size that we're coming to. When the U.S. Army, I think, goes under 525,000 men, and it's well under that now, and it's going below that, then we have to shift and reduce our political ends.
Thanks, General. Sure, respectfully, as it starts out here, is what are your thoughts about women in the infantry officers course?
Yeah. Well, you know, ladies and gentlemen, patriotism, patriots, I don't care what their gender, American patriots have always had a touchstone called the U.S. military. When you serve in the U.S. military, it sets you apart. You're an integral and yet distinct part of our culture, respected by all. There was a period when we lost sight of that in the late 60s and 70s, to our eternal shame for our Vietnam veterans. But overwhelmingly throughout our history, the veterans have been treated wonderfully. I had 60-odd nations on my staff at CENTCOM in Tampa, Florida. To a man and woman, they told me they were treated better in uniform out in town at the shopping mall in Tampa than they were in their own country in Europe, Asia, Africa, wherever they were from. So this is a touchstone of humanity that the U.S. military, a national treasure, envied by every leader in the world, that our president has something that is so wonderful, so ethical, so fierce, so capable, so humane. And why shouldn't women want to serve everywhere? The problem we face is that in the atavistic, primitive world of a Marine infantry, I'll just speak to what I was part of for 40-odd years, the idea of putting women in there is not setting them up for success. Could we find a woman who can run fast enough? Of course we could. Could you find a few who could do the pull-ups? Of course you could. That is not the point. That is not the point at all. It is whether or not you want to mix eros. Do you really want to mix love, affection, whatever you call it, in a unit where you, as a 20-year-old squad leader, can point at someone else and point forward, knowing full well you've now introduced all the affections and the testosterone and the love and everything else that goes into young people. And some of us aren't so old that we've forgotten that at times it was like heaven on earth just to hold a certain girl's hand, okay? So the challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes us most combat effective when you jump into that room and you're doing what we call intimate killing. Killing literally as close as I am from this lectern here. And there, I think it would only be someone who's never crossed a line of departure into close quarters fighting that would ever even promote such an idea. Aside from that, no strong thoughts on it, Sergeant Major.
Sure. They did preface with respectfully, sir. They did do that. Respectfully. Sir, what are the one or two of the biggest misperceptions about this generation of veterans, and how can we carry the message?
Yeah, I think the biggest misperception is that somehow we're damaged by this. I'm on record that it didn't really traumatize me to do away with some people who thought that slapping women around, I don't recommend you young officers say that, by the way, when there's a TV camera available. But the bottom line is that we have an enemy that is opening apocalyptically who they think they can kill. They can kill women, they can kill children, they kill men who don't pray properly, and this sort of thing. And we are going to have young people in our country who are willing to go toe-to-toe with this because two irreconcilable wills exist. The idea that women cannot go to school, that girls cannot go to school, we're never going to accept it. And against an enemy that never got into that position by reason, we're not going to reason him out of that position, that medieval position. So we're going to fight. And I think that when you look at the fighting itself, I'm amazed now that there is so much of this acceptance that we're somehow all post-traumatic stressed out. In Canada, there are troops coming home, I think it's Canada, they actually show them a movie saying, it's okay to be okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is something that comes out of the trauma of combat, and for those who have been through it and the shock absorber wasn't sufficient, there's not too much we can do. And our Veterans Administration, and by the way, I have intentionally taken my health care through the Veterans Administration to experience it personally. It is tremendous out of the VA. But at the same time, if our view of the veterans is one of disease orientation, of post-traumatic stress syndrome, of disorder, if you assume that there's something wrong with people, if you do it long enough, expectations are very strong. There's also something called post-traumatic growth, where you come out of a situation like that and you actually feel kinder toward your fellow man, fellow woman, that you are actually a better husband, father. You actually have a closer relationship with your God. You do not have to go around apologizing if there's some rage in you, although if we tell our veterans enough that this is what's wrong with them, they may actually start believing it. I would just say there's one misperception of our veterans, and that is they are somehow damaged goods. I don't buy it, and I think that that kind of self-pity, while victimhood in America is exalted, I don't think our veterans should join those ranks. Okay. Thank you.
So we're down to the final question, and I saved a doozy for you, if you will. It says, General Mattis, is there anything nowadays that's worth a four-star general or admiral retiring in protest over civilian decisions that are made with regards to our military?
Well, you know, hypothetically, of course there is. Had I ever been asked to do something unethical, immoral, or I would almost call it felony stupid, of course you would owe it to yourself, you'd owe it to your troops. But I think, too, you have to be very careful about doing that. The Lance Corporals can't retire, and they're going. That's all there is to it, okay? So when you do this, it's a one-time deal, and make sure you're not doing it because you think you're the font of all wisdom. Certainly you want to define the problem to yourself. Certainly you want to spend a lot of time defining it, and then you make the best decision you can. But in our system of government, I always expected to be heard as I rose in rank. I would sit in rooms where even as a four-star, I used the word sir or ma'am out of respect for the positions of the people I was speaking to. But while I expected to be heard, under our system of government, if you really believe in it, if you trust in it, if you have faith in it, you don't expect to be obeyed as a general. My portfolio was narrower than the president's. He was the commander-in-chief. He was voted in by the American people. And words like, you serve at the pleasure of the president, you can't say, well, those words only count when I agree and the president agrees with me. Loyalty really counts when there's 100 reasons not to be loyal. That's when loyalty counts. And so you stay loyal to the system, you serve at the pleasure of the president, you give your unvarnished advice, you give it in the most non-antagonistic, non-adversarial way you can, the most objective way you can. You demand that it be heard, although you don't have to demand hard. These are decent people. And then at the end of the day, you carry out your orders with a cheery aye aye. And if you cannot, for moral, for ethical reasons, for gross strategic reasons, then yes, you quit. But at the same time, be careful. Remember that Lance Corporal on whom the last 600 meters counts is going to look over at a corporal at some point, is going to point at him and say, go. And you abandon him only under the most dire circumstances where the message you have to send can be sent no other way. I never confronted that situation, did my best, and I still look in a shaving mirror, although I'm saddened, Diane, about the cost.
Thank you.